Hey everyone, this is Raboy from Couchbase. We're going to be walking through building a web application that allows you to use AngularJS and PouchDB to synchronize your data with Couchbase Server. So it'll allow you to synchronize between other web applications or even mobile applications. But for the purpose of this tutorial, we're just going to be worrying about the web side of things. So a few things here before we get started. I want to go ahead and discuss the requirements, what we're going to be using in this application. So first of all, we're going to be using AngularJS. So it's important to note this is going to be AngularJS version 1. I know AngularJS 2 is currently in beta, but for this we're going to be worrying about version 1. We're also going to be using PouchDB, which is an open source JavaScript library, and that's going to allow us to do the synchronization between Couchbase and our application. And we're going to use Bootstrap for styling our application. So I am not much of an artist myself, so Bootstrap is going to take a lot of this work out of it for me. So with that said, let's go ahead and first, I guess since I have my web browser open already, let's go ahead and first download all of these dependencies. So I got Bootstrap downloading. So PouchDB, it looks like it's on version 5.1. We're going to be making use of the AngularJS UI router, which will allow us to have multiple partial pages within our application to kind of simulate a multi-page application, even though it's really going to be a single-page application. And then, of course, AngularJS. Let's get the stable release. And we can go ahead and save that to our desktop as well. Perfect. It looks like all of that is downloaded. So I can go ahead and close the tabs. So I have my terminal here. I am using a Mac. If you're using a Windows computer, it's going to be a command prompt. But for the most part, the two should be pretty similar for at least what we're trying to do. So inside of your terminal, I'm navigated to my desktop. We're going to go ahead and create a new project directory. So I'm going to call it, let's call it PouchDB project. Perfect. And as you can see, it's on my desktop right here. And then inside of that, we're going to go ahead and create a few more directories. So let's go ahead and navigate in. Again, I'm using my terminal. You could do it the manual way if you want. It's up to you. So we're going to say make directory, and we want to say CSS. We also want a fonts directory, a JS directory, and then a templates directory. Perfect. As far as files go, we're going to go ahead and create a few files here. So we're just kind of laying out the foundation, the framework of our project. We're not doing any coding yet. But at the root of this project directory, let's go ahead and create a file called index. So you can, it doesn't really matter how you do it as long as it ends up in that directory. So it's going to be index.html. Perfect. And then we're going to navigate into the JS directory. And we're going to create a file called app.js. And I can see that it's trying to get me to upgrade. Don't want to upgrade now. So we're going to go ahead and say app.js, and again that's inside of our JS directory. And then at this point in time, we only have two more files left. So inside of templates, what we want to do is we want to first create a file called list. So let's go ahead and say cd templates. Oops, I'm in the wrong directory. And we want to say list.html. We also want to create a file called item.html. And right now, I believe that's all the files that we're going to use. If I think of another file that we're going to use later on in this tutorial, I'll make sure that it's clear. But for now, this is enough to get us started in creating our fully functional application. Also note that I do already have Couchbase running on my machine. So this is Couchbase Server, Couchbase Server 4.1 in particular. But 4.0 should be fine. And then I also have Couchbase Sync Gateway downloaded as well. Both are going to be required at the end of this tutorial. All right, so how about we get all of our files into our project first that we downloaded. So in the JS directory, let's go ahead and drag over Angular, the minified file. Let's go ahead and drag over PouchDB. Let's go ahead and extract the UI router. And we're going to find the distribution file or the release file. So we also want the minified file. We can get rid of that now on our desktop. No longer necessary. Well, let's go ahead and extract Bootstrap. And there's going to be a few JavaScript files in there. Let's go ahead and get the minified file. Everything else we don't need. Now let's go back one level in our project and let's start copying over some CSS files. So let's go ahead and copy over basically all the minified files is fine, even if we may not be using all of them. And then finally, let's go ahead and grab those fonts. Should be able to just copy everything that's in there. Perfect. All right, so all of our files are now in our project. We can actually start coding now. So inside of your favorite IDE or whatever you use to code, I'm going to be using Atom. Go ahead and open the index file. All right, so inside of this index file, we want to go ahead and add the following HTML. This is just kind of going to load all of our scripts and CSS and get kind of the ball rolling. So we're going to say doc type HTML, and then we're going to add some HTML tags. Some head tags, body, and then inside of our head tags we want to go ahead and start including all of those libraries. So let's start with the CSS. And then it should be in the CSS directory. We want to include bootstrap.min.css. And you know what, we're not going to be using Bootstrap theme. So you technically didn't need to drag it over, but it's not going to hurt us if we left it in there. We also want to make sure that we reference the CSS directory, otherwise it's not going to find that file. All right, now for the scripts. So let's say script, source, and then we have, let's see what we have here. We have js/angular.min.js script, and I'm just going to copy this line a few times to save me some typing here. We have Angular min.js, we have Angular UI router min.js, we have, what else do we have? We have bootstrap.min.js, we have PouchDB 5.1.0, and then finally app.js, and I believe that is all of them. Perfect. So all of our includes are there. Now if we look at our body portion, we can say div style equals padding. Let's give it a 20 pixel padding, and that'll just kind of make it less, move it a little inward so that way it doesn't look like it's falling off the page. Again, I'm not the best when it comes to design and UI, but that's kind of beyond the goal of this, which is lucky for me. Our goal is to make an application that syncs. So now we can type in div UI view and then div. So what's happening here is any of our UI router templates, so anything inside this templates directory, is going to be rendered inside of this tag right here. So technically, if you wanted to add styling out around that tag, you certainly could. That's perfectly fine. But we're going to keep things basic, and focus on functionality. So go ahead and save that. What we also want to do is we also want to, inside this body tag, we want to say ng app equals, and then let's call it pouch app. And we're going to create that name right now. So if you go into app.js, this is where all of our JavaScript is going to happen. This is all of our AngularJS code, all of the magic. So we're going to say angular.module pouch app. Did I call it pouch app or PouchDB app? Pouch app. And then we want to include the UI router. All right, so we have our module set up. Now what we want to do is we want to define our run and we want to define our config. So let's start with config. So let's say config, and this is all part of Angular. It's part of the development process. So for config, this is where we're going to define all of our routes, so all of our pages that we can navigate to within our application. So we're going to say function state provider URL router provider, and then inside of it we can say state provider, and then let's define a state. So let's call this list, and let's say the URL is /list, and let's say that the template URL is templates/list.html. Remember, we created that file. And then let's give it a controller. The controller is going to be main controller. And we're going to use this same controller for both of our pages. So we can copy this to save us a little bit of typing here. Paste it in. And our next state is going to be item. So item, let's just change everything to item here. But we're not done yet. So we do have an item state. It's technically an item state, but we need to add some optional URL parameters to this. So in case somebody tries to pass in information, which is going to prove useful when it comes to editing information. So let's go ahead and say / and then colon document ID and then colon document revision. So we can accept two parameters. We can accept a document ID, which is going to be the key of the document, and then a particular revision. In case we don't want to work with the most recent revision, we have the opportunity to make changes to a different revision of that same document. Perfect. Now we need to define a default state. So let's say URL router provider dot otherwise and then list. So by default, it will load the list state if item was not chosen. So if somebody enters the wrong one, it'll automatically take them to list, which is good because it'll prevent 404 errors. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to create our controller. And I also don't want this semicolon there, it'll cause errors. So controller, and let's say for this controller, it will have, it'll be main controller, and it'll include a scope, a root scope, a state, and state params. For now, at least. We're going to add more to it soon. All right, but you know what? Before we start working with the controller and PouchDB and synchronization, why don't we first worry about creating the templates that we created up here. So we're going to get all the UI stuff out of the way first, and then we're going to worry about the logic. So starting with list, let's open up that file, and let's add the following. So we want to add a button at the top. That button is going to have bootstrap styles. Perfect. Sorry, I'm not the fastest typer, but we'll get there eventually. Now let's create a table. So this is just going to be a simple app. It's going to be a button for adding new items to the table, and then a table for showing those items. So let's say class equals table striped. All right. So now let's create a table head. All right, this table head is going to be our headings for the table, so they'll be in bold. So let's say first name. Here, I'll speed this up a bit. All right, so we got first name, last name. Let's say email. And then we'll leave the last one blank because it'll give us the opportunity to add like an edit and a delete button in there. So now we can create the table body. And in here, so we're going to create a TR for table row, and then let's go ahead and create those columns. But we're actually going to loop through data. So this data is going to come, of course, from Couchbase, and it's going to end up in our AngularJS logic, but we want to go ahead and loop through and print all of it to the screen. So we're going to create a loop. Let's say ng repeat equals key value in items. So we're going to create this items object when we start working with the logic. So just keep that in mind. We'll cycle back and forth. Let's assume that the value has a property first name. Let's also assume value has a property of last name. And then value has a property of email. And save it. Now we're also going to have an edit and a delete, but we're going to leave those out for now. They will eventually be links, but I think it'll make more sense after we get the logic behind that before we try to actually make those links. All right, now let's open up the item.html. This is our final bit of UI. This is just going to be a form. And let's say div class equals form group. Form control, let's say ID equals first name, placeholder equals first name, ng model equals input form dot first name, and that should do the ticket for that. Now let's do the next one. So we have our first name box. Let's create our last name box. All right, so we have last name, and then finally let's do email. Perfect. All right, so we have the input forms. Now we need to add some buttons. So let's say button type equals button, class equals btn. Let's say this one is danger, and then let's say cancel button. Let's clone that that row here. And let's say this button is going to be success, and it'll be a save button. Perfect. So our UI is done. We don't really have any functionality. Some things to elaborate here, just to go over. So our ng model, this is going to be in our AngularJS logic. It's a type of binding. So anything that we input into this field will be accessible from our logic file, and anything that we change in the logic file will be accessible through that field. All right. Now what we want to do is we want to go back into app.js, and before we start touching our controller, we want to go ahead and create a PouchDB service. This service will make life a little bit easier when it comes to saving stuff, because out of the box, PouchDB works best with vanilla JavaScript. It doesn't work the best out of the box with AngularJS. It's not necessarily hard to fix that, but it is definitely a JavaScript library rather than an AngularJS library. So what we want to do is we want to create a service here. Let's call it PouchDB. And it's going to contain root scope. It's going to contain queue for promises. And then let's add those in. Perfect. All right, now let's start adding to this service here. So let's start by saying, let's say a database. These are just variables that we're making, and then var change listener. And we'll see why those are important right now. So let's say we want to set the database. So let's say this set database equals function database name. So if we want to set the database, then we can do that through this function call. So let's say database equals new PouchDB. Now PouchDB is an actual function from that PouchDB library. Let's say database name. So keep it simple. Now what we want to do is we want to create a listener. So let's say this dot start listening equals function. And this is where we're making it a little more Angular friendly, because this is the one that's kind of the toughest to work with. So we're saying change listener equals database changes. Now let's say live is true, so it's like a live query. Include docs true. These are our options, by the way. And now we can do an on statement. So we can say on change. So this is a change event function. Say if change.deleted. So if this is a delete change, then we're going to say root scope dot broadcast PouchDB change, and it's going to be a change. So I mean, we're going to keep it simple. Else, we're going to say because it wasn't. So in this event it is a delete. So we're going to say just delete. And then when we program this in the Angular side of things, inside of our controller, we'll be able to listen for these broadcasts very easily. Put a semicolon on there. Now let's say this dot stop listening. So we're just making things nice and clean here. And we can say change listener dot cancel. All right, that was pretty easy. Now this dot sync equals function remote database. So this is the remote database that we're going to be syncing with. This will be our Couchbase sync gateway. So let's say database.sync remote database, and let's say live true retry true semicolon. All right, we're wrapping things up. We're almost done with this service. Now, of course, we need to be able to save to the service. So let's say this.save equals function JSON document. So we're going to be passing it a JSON document. And this is where we're going to start working with promises to keep things asynchronous. So we're going to say var deferred equals q.defer. We're going to say if JSON document dot underscore ID. So in the case that we don't have an ID, then we can say database dot post JSON document, and then function response. All right, so in this event, we don't have an ID because we're actually doing an insert. We're not doing an update, we're doing an insert. Otherwise, if we're updating, we do have the ID. So in the event of a successful insert, we're going to say deferred dot resolve response. And then in the event of unsuccessful, we can actually say dot catch function error and deferred dot reject error. Perfect. Now in the event that it's an update, here's what we want to do. We want to say database put instead of post JSON document dot then function response. So this is essentially more or less the same as the last one. So again, I'm just going to copy this. Saves us some typing there. So it's just either going to be a put or a post. Put for update, post for insert. All right, so the save is done. Well, it's almost done. We didn't return the promise, so we want to say return deferred.promise. All right, now it's done. And we're almost done with the service. We have, I think, 3 more functions left. So let's say this.delete equals function document ID and then document revision. And let's go ahead and get the other ones out of the way first before we start coding them. So this dot get equals function for getting documents, document ID, and then finally this dot destroy equals function. Perfect. So starting with this line because it's short, database dot destroy, and this will destroy our database. For get, let's say return database dot get. So this is a PouchDB function, so document ID. And then for delete, we have return database dot delete. Sorry, not delete. Remove document ID document revision. Perfect. All right, so this is all done. We did a lot here, so I'll reiterate through it just to catch everyone up in case you fell a little bit behind. We created a PouchDB service to kind of wrap PouchDB into a more Angular friendly library. So we are storing the local database and the change listener. So we're setting that here. We start listening, and every time there's a change from the PouchDB change listener, we broadcast that using AngularJS. So if it detects that there's a change, broadcast that a change was made, otherwise broadcast that a delete was made. We can stop the listener. We can sync to Couchbase. We can do saves, so saves can be either an insert or an update. And then of course delete, get, and destroy. All right, so now that it's out of the way, now let's worry about the rest of our AngularJS file. Now earlier I told you that we were going to be doing a config and a run, and I didn't do the run earlier, but let's go ahead and do that now. So below the config, let's say .run, and let's say function. Now we can pass in that nice new PouchDB service, PouchDB, that we made. And let's say PouchDB.setDatabase, and let's call it, let's go ahead and call it PouchDB sample. That's going to be our local database. And then let's go ahead and say PouchDB.sync. So this is going to be where we're synchronizing to. So this is, of course, we're going to be synchronizing with the Couchbase sync gateway, which is then going to be synchronizing between your application and Couchbase server. So let's say HTTP localhost 4984, and then let's call it, to stay consistent, PouchDB sample. So the remote database and the local database are going to be named the same thing. So while we're not currently running this sync gateway, I am currently running Couchbase Server, but not sync gateway yet. We'll get to that shortly. All right, now we want to add the last part of our AngularJS logic. So before we go there, let's go ahead and add our final dependency, which is PouchDB. Now we can start coding. So let's say scope.items equals an object, because remember in our UI, in our template, we're using an object rather than an array. And let's say PouchDB.start listening. And now we're actually listening for changes with PouchDB. So root scope.on. So now we're going to figure out what we want to do when we found a broadcast. So PouchDB change. So this is a change broadcast. Event data. We won't populate it yet. Let's copy this, and remember we have a delete event too. So delete, and you know what? Just for the heck of it, let's first get all of our functions out of the way before we start filling them with juicy material. Now we want to say, let's say scope.save equals function, and we're going to pass in a first name, a last name, and an email. And we want a delete. So scope.delete, and we're going to pass it in an ID and a revision. Perfect. So let's, since delete is pretty easy, let's get that out of the way first. So PouchDB.delete, and then just pass in the ID and revision, because that's what we set up in our service. PouchDB delete down here, right here. All right, so now moving back up to save, let's say var JSON object equals first name, and then whatever was passed, last name, email. All right, perfect. So that's our object. We've just created it. And now we can actually do one more thing here. So what we want to do is we want to see if this is going to be an update or a delete. So, or not an update or a delete, I mean an update or an insert. So we can do the following. If state params dot document ID. So this means that if the URL bar contains all those extra parameters, which are optional, then we know that this is going to be an update rather than an insert. So we can say JSON document, and let's say ID equals state params dot document ID, and let's go ahead and clone that line. The second line being a revision, document revision, and they're named exactly what we said in the config up here. So that's normal. All right, so now we're sure that in all scenarios this object is ready to go, whether it be an insert or an update. So we can say PouchDB save, pass in the JSON object, and then function response. Otherwise, there was an error. Let's say console.log error. Let's say JSON stringify, because we don't really know what kind of error it's going to be. It could be an object, and that won't print out nicely inside the logs if you don't stringify it first. All right, now we can say state.go because save was successful. We can say state.go and then navigate us back to the list, because this assumes that we're on the item page, not the list page. So when we hit save, we want to go back to the list page with whatever changes came along with it. All right, now for these listeners here for change and delete. Let's start with change. So what we can do is we can say scope.items data.doc._ID. So this is going to be the it's kind of like an associative array if you want to think of it that way. Data.doc. So it's going to be defined by its ID. That's how it's going to be like a hash map here. So now we can say scope.apply and save. So every time a change happens, it's going to be added to this object, and then we're going to apply it so that way it's refreshed on the screen. All right. Now for the delete, let's say the following: delete scope.items data.doc_ID. Now I bet you can probably see why I chose to do an object rather than an array, because when you delete it this way, you don't have to first iterate through the array to figure out where it's located. You can just instantly delete it by its key. And scope apply and save it. There's one more thing that we need to add here. We need to add in the event where this is going to be an edit. We want to be able to pre-populate the form that we designed. So let's go ahead and do a condition here. So if state params .document ID, and now we can do a get. We want to get whatever's in the database by that document ID. So we can say PouchDB .get state params .document ID, then function response. It could be response, it could be result, whatever you want to name it. And then let's say scope.inputForm equals response. So response is going to be an object, of course, and input form, remember, is an object as well, because inside of item we have input form first name, last name, and email. All right, so at this point in time, our logic should be good, unless I made some kind of typo along the way. We should be good in that territory, but we need to go back and we need to make a few revisions to our front end, because I left certain things out, and we just kind of need to fill in the gaps now. So starting with list.html, remember the edit and then the delete. Let's go ahead and change those into links now. So let's say A and then href, and then UI sref. This sref stuff is how you use the UI router, by the way, to change pages and whatnot. All right, and then delete is going to do the same thing. We're going to have a link there. But instead of a delete, it's actually going to be on a click, because we're not actually changing pages with delete. All right, so why don't we start with delete since we've already scrolled over here. Let's say we did create a delete function. We called it delete, and it expected an ID, a document ID, and a revision. So we can say value._ID because it's part of our items object, and then value._revision. That should do it for delete. Now let's check out this sref, so for changing states. So we can say item, and we can pass in some parameters here. So document ID, it's going to be key, and then document revision is going to be value._rev. So that should be good. We should be in a pretty solid state right now. We already have the UI sref up here. That's going to take us to the item page without parameters, which is fine. So now we can jump into item.html because we left a little bit out of that. So for example, when we hit cancel, it's going to take us back to the list. So UI sref equals list with no parameters. And then in the event of a click, a save, let's do ng click equals save. And let's say input form dot first name, input form dot last name, input form dot email. And that should do the trick here. Perfect. So at this point in time, I want to say our application is done, but we're not ready to start using it. We now have to worry about configuring the sync gateway. So the sync gateway has its own configuration file. So if we can navigate back into our terminal, because we don't have to. You could actually just create a file at the root of your project. Let's call it sync gateway config.json. And we're going to add some stuff here to it. Let's make sure that it's at the root. Yeah, it's at the root. So it's going to be a JSON file, and it's going to be a little bit long, but it's going to be very basic. So we're not adding any kind of authorization or authentication. That can all be added. It's all in the documentation, but we're going to keep it very simple. So all users will be able to access all data in this scenario. So log, we're going to say CRUD plus, REST plus, changes plus, attach plus. And then let's say databases. And then for the database, what do we call it? We call that PouchDB sample, I think. If that's not the case, we'll go back and figure it out. But for the sample, let's go ahead and say for the server, it's going to be HTTP localhost 4985, and then it's going to be that's it. So that should be good. I had a brain stump there for a second. I forgot the port, but that's all right. So it's 4985. Now let's go ahead and figure out our sync. So let's say sync. We're going to do a backtick here because there's going to be some logic. So we're going to say function doc channel doc.channels. All right, so it's very basic. Like I said, all the data is going to be in the same channel. Everyone's going to have access to it. There's not too much going on there. So do a comma. So for users, we're going to allow the guest user. disabled false admin channels, and then we're going to say asterisk, so it's going to be everything. Perfect. Now you drop down to the end of this. Now we need to configure some stuff for cores, because this is, at least for testing purposes, going to be on a different domain. And by domain, I'm actually referring to, it's going to actually be a different port, because we're all going to be on localhost, but you'll get cross-origin resource sharing issues if you're on a different port. So you have to include this logic in here as well. So cores origin HTTP localhost port 9000. So that's going to be the port that we're running this server on. Login origin HTTP localhost 9000 headers content type, then max age. Let's say 172.8.1.2.3.4. Some really long age. It's all right. All right. So now, with a little bit of luck, all of this should be good. So let's go back to my Firefox. I'm going to do a new window here. I'm going to first log into Couchbase Server. Going to go to data buckets. I already have that bucket created, PouchDB sample, and it's empty. So we're going to leave that up. I'm going to go back into my terminal here, and I'm going to go back a level. This should be the root. Yeah, that's the root. I'm going to open up another tab in my terminal, because my terminal is going to run two different things. It's going to run both my local server and then the Couchbase Sync Gateway server. So let's go ahead and go back a level. Let's go to Couchbase Sync Gateway, which was on my desktop, bin, and let's type in Sync Gateway, and then go back to my desktop. Let's go into the PouchDB app, and then run our Sync Gateway config file. Hit enter, and there was an error. So that was my mistake. I know why I sat here for a second wondering about the server line and the port, because I was thinking of the wrong port. I actually typed in the Sync Gateway port, but in reality what we want is the Couchbase Server port, which is 8091. So in theory, it should work at this point. So let's try to run it again. And the bind address is already in use. So to fix that bind address already in use error, so that happens sometimes in the case where you don't terminate correctly. At least I found on my Mac, because maybe I've closed the terminal wrong, or I've shut down, or for some similar related crazy reason. If you have to, you can run this to find that process and kill it. So you would type lsof and then the port, so 4985. Hit enter, and then it'll tell you a PID. So you can say kill 9 and then 59839 should be killed now. So if I try to run my command again, it worked without problems this time. So if I go to Firefox here and refresh, so Sync Gateway has already created its 3 meta documents. So that tells me that everything so far looks good to go. So going back to my terminal, I'm going to go to my other tab, and I'm going to use Python to run this particular local server. You can use whatever you want. There's plenty of ways to solve this problem, but for Mac and Linux users at least, This is probably the most easy of the solutions. So I'm going to type in Python m simple HTTP server and then 9000 for my port. Alright, so it looks like it's good. I'm going to open up a new tab here, localhost 9000. So here's our application. It's pretty simple. Really not too much to it. I'm not much of a designer myself, which is alright. So let's go ahead and do a new item. Say Nick, Raboy, nick@test.com, and save it. So it added it here. Let's see if it added it to Couchbase Server. And it looks like it did. So if I click it, here it is. Here's that document. Of course, there's metadata to go with it, which is normal. But here is the data that we care about because it's the data that we saved. So let's go ahead and expand upon this. Let's see if the rest of our features work. So let's say edit. So it didn't populate, so there could be an error somewhere, but it looks like our URL bar is correct. So let's just, for the heck of it, see if, oh, it did. So maybe my browser is having issues. Not to worry. I'm going to go ahead and click save because it populated. I guess my browser just had an issue. Changing it to my full name, and I'm hitting save, and it didn't work. JSON document is not defined on line 51. So let's take a look at what line 51 is. Perfect. All right. So I named it JSON object here, and I named it JSON document there. So let's go ahead and fix that. So let's say JSON object. So normal error. I mean, I did type a lot of stuff. So let's go back. Let's just for safe reasons, let's go ahead and restart that server. We'll go back, refresh. Let's close this for now. Edit. I don't know what's going on with my browser there, but in Chrome it normally works. So let's change that to full, hit save, and you can see that my full name is now there. So let's confirm that it exists in Couchbase Server. Yeah, so the update looks like it worked. So if I go back to our final step here, let's try the delete, see if that works. So hit delete. Looks like it removed it from there. And deleted true, so it's good. So it worked. So everything that we set off to do proves to have worked as of right now. So just to kind of reiterate everything that we've done, because we did quite a bit. So we created this web application using only front-end technologies. So we used AngularJS, we used CSS for Bootstrap, we used HTML, and then we used the PouchDB library, which allowed us to connect to the Sync Gateway by Couchbase to synchronize data between Couchbase Server and our application. We didn't have to use any technologies like Java or Node.js. Inside of our application, we made a nice little wrapper for PouchDB, and then we made use of it inside of our controller, and we had two different page routes, a list route and a item route. So we did a lot, and it was actually pretty successful. This code, the full code that you saw me type out right now, is actually on GitHub. So if you go to github.com/couchbaselabs and do a search for PouchDB, this example should show up, and all you have to do is download it and give it a shot.